Hi, good morning, guys. My name is Madeline Perez, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. And I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming our first speaker in the Competitive Advantage Room 2, Dr. Phil Wagner, who is the CEO and founder of Sparta Science. Today's panel on Can You Really Predict Sports Injury and Performance is going to be 30 minutes, including Q&A. So without further ado, here is Dr. Phil Wagner.
Good morning. Whoa, getting used to the mic. So my name is Phil Wagner. I founded Sparta Science. And what if I told you we could predict an injury off a vertical jump? Specifically predict an upper body injury off a jump. I know a lot about injuries because as an athlete, had muscle strains, fractures, concussions. And so I became a strength conditioning coach to learn about how injuries were addressed, how performance was enhanced, exposed to some great tactics, both domestically and abroad, but ultimately it came down to guesswork. So I went to medical school to learn how evidence was applied to patients. From there, set up a facility to help athletes, and athletes only, and by that I mean high school, college, and professional. And that's important because if we talk about data, we want to be looking at the same species, right? What we call, trying to avoid civilians to make sure that data is a little bit more homogeneous. Being in the Silicon Valley, see if I can get that clicked. There we go. Being in the Silicon Valley, I ran into a software engineer. There's a few of them out there. We're right across the street from Facebook. And he saw an incredible opportunity to take software and apply it to this performance facility that we created. Much to his wife's displeasure, we started seeing causes and patterns, brought him on board, a software team on board, and having that combination of a facility, a training facility, and a tech company makes us very unique because everything we collect, we're held accountable that we're going to use that data. Now we're used all over the world, from the MLB. I'm going out now. Thankfully, our software doesn't work like that. So we're used all over the world, right? And so whether it's the MLB, NFL, NCAA, United Kingdom, South Africa, Australia, what that allows is all that data allows us to have incredible insights. So over the past 7 years, that allows us to predict injuries, predict performance. And that's important because there's a lot of terms being thrown out there for prediction, right? And if you've only been around for a year or gathering data for a year, it generally takes about 3 to 5 years to build prediction models. Sparta has that time you just can't make up. And so in 2014, with a Major League Baseball team, we were able to predict 99 injuries over the course of the year, from elbow to hamstring. And that's possible even in the first year because what we're doing is we've set up an anonymous aggregated database, just like medicine. And so we start looking at surgeries and days missed for those injuries. We're start looking at an ability to predict $22.5 million. We're able to predict a savings in injuries of $22.5 million for a season. One of the reasons we're able to do that is what we're looking at in sports is an epidemic. And this is a graph of UCL injuries, ulnar collateral ligament injuries, over the past 30 years. That is an epidemic. It's a rapid spread of disease in a specific community. Could be a longer season for these guys, bigger, faster, stronger. Right, they're throwing harder, whatever it is, we're seeing it in all sports, this trend. In Major League Baseball, they lost over $700 million due to injury in 2014. Best place to address an epidemic is to look at medicine. The outcome's the same. We want to make sure that we get to the end point more efficiently, right? That patient outcome, that point B. Same way with athletes. And it starts with clinical expertise, right? You walk into a doctor's room, they listen to your lungs, got a good idea if you have pneumonia or not. They've heard thousands of lungs. Same way a coach or a trainer watches an athlete move, has an idea of compensation patterns or deficiencies. And then you've got athlete input or patient input. I can remember walking into patient rooms and they had a printout of their diagnoses before we even talked. Right? They'd go search WebMD or whatever and they knew what they had already. Athletes are no different. They have access to information and their input has to be taken into account. And the last piece is medically based studies. So with medically based studies, the reality is what's the standard of care? What's the best practice, right? And it starts with documentation. But an app or a platform or a database, it's not enough. What you need is an assessment. So for us, the first step in this assessment process is a Sparta scan. It is a patented assessment that looks at fatigue, strengths and weaknesses for that athlete, and even talent identification. Organizations use it for draft, free agent analysis, and it's based off a force plate. And a force plate really is based off Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If I push down, I go up. If I push left, I go right. And force dictates most movement. What took a long time is that for years, we had to figure out, okay, what's the number of trials we're going to do? What's the standardized warm-up beforehand? Because to make this like medicine, we wanted to make it universal across sites, like when you gather blood and then look at your fasting blood glucose. Has to be standardized. So these are two of our athletes performing the assessment right here at our training facility. That blue rectangle is a force plate. And it's portable, weighs about 40 pounds. First question we get, why are we jumping? The answer is reliability. We need an assessment that has good data. We looked at a bunch of other tests, sprinting, agility, throwing, hitting, jumping off one leg. The reality is those tests aren't reliable or as reliable. What we've got to look at is what variables are reliable. Specifically in the jump, the first part of that jump, the first variable, is how well you go from that standing to the squatting position, what we call your load. It's predictive for more successful linemen, more successful catchers in baseball. Then we've got your explode, how quickly you come out of the bottom. We see it higher in basketball players, soccer players, predictive of their success. And then we've got your drive, how well you prolong that movement. See it high in rotational athletes, quarterbacks, golfers, pitchers, corner guys. Now, when we put those together and give them a number, this is what we call a movement signature. So they're represented by 3 bars in the software. And a movement signature, think about it like an athlete's fingerprint. It's their individual solution to the problems that they're going to face in sport. And so this is a case study of one of our athletes. His name is Tyson Ross. He gave us permission to use his information. And so that load, explode, and drive of Tyson's is given a number, a T-score, which is like a more accurate percentile. So 50 is average. That's important because the plate and the vertical jump, these aren't new concepts. What is new is that we're able to build thresholds. Sparta's able to create thresholds of what's meaningful or not. And what we found was that even is not the goal. We don't want the athletes even. In Tyson's case, we wanted to increase his load and his drive. Tyson eventually became an all-star pitcher, a starter. And we've worked with third parties like Stanford School of Medicine, BYU Statistics to validate a healthy imbalance. So much so, this curve is actually associated with ground ball percentage. So a pitcher's ability to get the opposition to ground out is increased by this signature. Sorry, I had a little... One of the theories as to why that U shape represents a good pitcher is that loading portion is similar to that pitcher loading that back leg, and the drive is similar to his finish over the front side. So we know that it's associated with better pitchers. Then comes a theory as to why. Now, if we look at another athlete, another movement signature, that result you get from the scan, this is from a minor league pitcher. We'll call him Johnny, real case study. Same even signature as Tyson. Very different outcome. His drive went up, but his load did not. And remember when I told you we could predict an upper body injury from a jump. John actually tore his UCL. He had a severe elbow injury shortly after this scan. And we now have a publication that shows as that drive goes up without load, it's predictive of a severe elbow injury. Specifically, when that drive is more than 15 from the others. John's obstacle is the same as all of us. It's time. How do we prioritize everything that's available to help John the most? And this is where Sparta's patents are based around, is not only the classification of the signatures, the force, but also bringing that to action and prescriptions. The lowest variable is where we start. That's relatively easy. So as part of his plan, we're going to address load first. And then we look at, well, is that second variable, is it more than 5 from the others? And actually it's not, it's only 1 away. So we're going to address the next one, which is explode. And then we're looking at left versus right differences. We have another assessment that looks at that. And we found that his upper body stability was lacking when looking at his left versus his right. We've got to take into account that regeneration, his recovery attempts. He's logging nutrition, his hydration, his sleep. John's worst value was sleep, which has an association with injuries. So we program that just like an exercise. And so that software, Sparta's Insights, allows those branches to be identified within the decision tree. I've seen a lot of these plans. I've actually seen someone post-it notes with professional teams. I've seen paper. Everybody's got an app now. And that's important because we can't confuse being digital with being scientific. So we know what the best plan is for each of those variables. Specifically, an example is we know if you squat 80% of your body weight for 5 sets of 5, we know where you're going to be in 14 days. We've had general managers actually call and ask, hey, we've got a guy who's at risk. If we rest him, how long will it take for him to be back, or for him to have that risk reduced? And so what we're talking about here, it's a prescription. It's a discrete timeline and exercise. It's not a concept. It's not a hunch. And one of the ways that we know these plans is that our staff goes on site. We roll our sleeves up. We figure out how this can be used on a daily basis seamlessly within an organization. Now we know that life's not in a vacuum, right? That very difficult to have controlled studies in this environment. So we got to centralize all this information into one place, a dashboard. So we're aware of how we could help John. The biggest predictor of any injury, though, is a previous injury. So we've got to be aware, okay, did John have a previous injury? And he did. He actually had ulnar neuritis, which is associated with upper body injuries. So it adds a second risk to a risk that was already there from the way he moved. The biggest stimulus, though, is from sport. So we're counting how many pitches he's thrown in the last 30 days. And it actually lights up red because it's more than 2 standard deviations above his normal pitch count over 30 days. What that does is it adds a risk. So we're aware of 3 risks now. There we go. We're aware of 3 risks. Now, knowing this information, gathering this information, centralizing it for simplification, we could have saved John's career, knowing that information. So, to summarize, Sparta is all about intent. We're able to decrease injuries 10 to 20% each year for an organization. Starts with an assessment, a scan, a movement signature. Then an athlete logs a plan for 3 rounds. There's alerts ideally coming from sport, injury, and ultimately adaptation, all keeping the athlete at the center. You want to click that? Ooh. Yeah. That one. Play off that one. So it kind of killed my finale there. It was rolling. So we started this discussion and looked at vertical jump. And I asked you, what if we could predict an injury from vertical jump? Right? And ultimately that's important because we want to make sure these athletes don't become patients. Thank you for your guys' time. I want to open it up for questions either on this presentation or the industry in general. Yeah. Right. So right now, our sleep is monitored through subjective entry, right? Which sometimes, depending on whether your contracts are guaranteed or not, tends to vary, right? So yeah, right now it's a subjective entry. We use an app where the athlete's entering their sleep on their phone. Yeah. Yeah.
Where do you see incorporation of other physiological data like body chemistry type data?
Yeah, I think so. The incorporation of other body chemistry data would go in that dashboard depending on either the resources for the organization or the sport. But yeah, certainly the force plate, we're not a force plate company, we're a database company, and so the force plate's a major piece of that, but obviously those other biomarkers just strengthen those predictive models, right? We see that's a future area for growth, whether it's looking at gender, ethnicity, all these other factors that might strengthen and guide us into what the best exercise is, much like medicine, right? Different blood pressure medications exist for different ethnicities or different biomarkers. Yeah? Right, so we do a, I'm gonna have to put you to work actually. I want to play that one. Let's see if we can play that. So this is a balance assessment that we use, and it's left versus right. It's 20 seconds, 2 on each side. We found it's actually more reliable when the eyes are closed for the athlete, probably because they get bored if your eyes are open. So it's actually more reliable, and it looks at left versus right. We use it, and organizations use it if you can't jump. The injury predictors are much greater for the dynamic movement, but this, obviously, if you can't jump, this is a way to benchmark how return to play and the rehab is going. It's also done on one arm. So we have athletes for an upper body assessment in a push-up position, and then they remove one arm for that balance profile. What will come out is we also look at one leg landing. So in this later stage return to play, we look at how hard an athlete can land and how quickly they can stabilize. Unlike the other movements we looked at, there is a learning effect to this test, which is important because we want the athlete to learn how to be aggressive if they're going to return to their sport. So it's dictated by how hard you land and stabilize quickly. Therefore, you can't kind of creep into it. You've got to be confident that whatever injury you have on your left or right is going to be effective. This is what the output is. From that balance test, the athlete will get a T-score of left versus right, 48 to 51. If it's below 40, there's a large risk increase. If there's a difference of 10, there's a large injury increase. So this is a real athlete who got sent to us by an international sports organization. He's 3 months post-knee injury. And so if we look at the other piece to this, that later stage return to play, this is his landing test. So not quite ready for sport, ready for more aggressive training, but that later stage return to play is not ready yet. I'm going to get some exercise today. Does that answer your question on left versus right? So that's how we look at it, both from a postural stability and then as a dynamic stability, and using those numbers and data to guide those thresholds. Yeah?
You said that past injuries are a good predictor of future injuries. How do you work with the past injuries to prevent the future?
Right, so they're added to the predictive model we use, and for the stats guys in the room, it's just another covariate that helps us change, okay, well, this plan's right for this guy based on his signature, but he has an existing injury, so he would need a different plan. So those decision trees are run by our statistics partners and help, as those covariates are added, if they become significant, different plans are provided. Yeah?
How reliable is this methodology for youth? Because a lot of habits are formed early, so is there preventative measures to prevent the habit from forming?
Right, so how can this be applied to youth? Right now, our database only has high school, college, and professional. So we haven't applied it younger than that high school realm. Maybe it's because we don't want to deal with the parents of those youth that would send these people in to get biomechanically assessed and trained for 2 hours every day. But certainly that's a market we see us expanding into, hopefully at a more casual, encouraging, more informal level. But yeah, I think there's an opportunity. Yeah.
Is there any work with individual sports like figure skating or gymnastics or diving where the jump itself is actually a key aspect of performance?
So we haven't done a lot of work with the individual athletes other than track and field, but we work a lot in the NBA, and our first client was Kansas basketball, University of Kansas, and their jumping is a big part of their sport. We work with track athletes, but in California, where we're from, there's not a lot of figure skating out there, not a lot of the winter. There is? All right, from Los Angeles? There you go. All right. I just haven't met him, yeah. Yeah, I think it's great sports, especially with figure skating. There's so many facets to that. Yeah.
There's been a lot of developments recently with products that are more in-game, to measure a lot of different aspects. Do you see Sparta sort of expanding into that kind of development?
Yeah, so great question. Expanding into in-game wearables. So one of the key parts about this test is it's physical. And so it eliminates the skill, which is important because we're really trying to help organizations evaluate, okay, is this guy physically at his peak or his potential, right? Or does he need more skill work? So the baseball team example, we work with an MLB team, and we have an athlete on that team that has all three of those variables above 65. Fantastic physically. So he spends about a third of his time now training. The rest of the time is spent watching film. He's a catcher, blocking balls, taking extra swings. So our role we see is to help completely rule out that physical aspect. So while the in-game's key and critical, we would use that data to help see fatigue and their overall physicality as opposed to use it as analysis, because it's too hard to siphon out, right, the skill versus the physical. Yeah. Yeah.
At one point when you were showing the pitcher signature, it was said, well, he's got to have a higher load, he's got to have a higher rate, the third one was called.
Drive, yeah.
So that, that was a better situation. So are there any situations where you say, oh, actually we need to bring down his, second bar because that's actually a better signature, or do you find that it's, strictly increasing is better generally?
So and that's a great point. When we look at the plans or exercises effect on those variables, a key piece is the negative effect that we look at too. And so that's important because if we're trying to bring down a value, but we're giving something that doesn't bring it down, right? That's where the branch points become key, because most of these exercises have an equal and sometimes greater effect on the negative aspects for those variables. So squat is the largest effect on load. It's the biggest negative detractor of drive. So if we're trying to flip those at the same time, a lot of exercises do it simultaneously.
But you do sometimes try to bring down some of the
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, like the example we used with the higher drive, we want to bring that down and make sure we do nothing that would raise it up, but actually do movements that purposely bring it down. Yeah. Yes?
How individualized are these plans? Do you do them by position? Is it like starters, baseball? How does that work?
Yeah, it's great. So positions are certainly a different factor, mostly from the loading, right? Because some, defensive backs are going to run a little bit faster in practice than linemen, right? So we're taking into account that aspect from a positional standpoint. From a pure movement standpoint, what's interesting is what's shared is skill sets as opposed to the sport itself, right? So point guards look like defensive backs, quarterbacks look like pitchers, right? So there's more carryover between skill sets than there is within the particular sport. Yeah. Yeah.
How correlated are these scores with the player's input? So does these scores is correlated with a discomfort that a player is feeling at the moment?
Yeah, we haven't correlated it with any of the subjective variables. We do that because it's important, and I think this is important to remember. This is certainly a technology product and a management system, but it can't ever replace discussions, right? And so where some of the subjective values, whether it's sleep or soreness or whatever it may be, that should usually prompt these organizations to have a discussion with the athlete, because it could be well beyond the physical. Right? There could be a lot of psychological components of why that athlete's reporting it that way, especially in guys who tend to manifest psychological to physical. You know, females are a little bit more emotionally intelligent. Yeah. Yeah.
Chip Kelly of the Eagles has some fairly public, interactions with players about not buying in necessarily via the HQ process. He's also criticized those decisions. And I was wondering what you had thoughts about how do you get buy-in? How do you get players to think that this is worth all?
It's a great word, buy-in. Yeah, so how do we get the buy-in from players? I mean, the first part is getting buy-in from the organization. So I mentioned we go on site and work with the organization, because this technology should never replace that culture, right? They build their culture. We just try to find ways to customize it so it's seamless. So from an organization standpoint, what we've seen, the ones that have the most effect are the ones that are the most transparent with that information. So if they're gathering the information, showing the athlete, talking to him about it as to why, there's a lot more trust that's built, right? We work with an NBA team, and when I went on site, the first time we did the assessments, their performance director said, okay, guys, let's make sure we put all this together. Anytime we gather data, we want the athletes to go through it within 24 hours. So that type of transparency we've seen has had a larger effect on adoption or buy-in. Yeah? Yeah, in terms of the assessment? Are they blind? No, but the test has been, part of the process is the variables and the trials are averaged, and so we've had studies done showing a lack of familiarization to the test. With the exception of load, that first variable, there is more of a learning effect or a compensation, but looking at the results, it actually makes it a sensitive factor. So if athletes are having pain or any sort of soreness, that first variable is the one that gets manipulated. But because the test is based off performance and jump height, there's less likelihood that athletes try to cheat it. But you can cheat any test, right? If I got a blood glucose test, I could eat a Cinnabon before and throw off my results. So, yeah. Absolutely. So do we see the future of Sparta, right? Helping athletes and organizations prioritize their time better, right? And that's absolutely right. Ultimately, technology, that should be the major goal, is to make us more efficient, right? And so the idea is we gather more information both from the force plate and the sport itself, that those decision trees allow the organization, the athlete, to be more efficient, right? To be able to do nothing that wouldn't help them, right? Because we're all limited by time. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were able to predict 99 injuries. What are the most common injuries that you're able to predict, and what are injuries that you think you'll be able to predict more strongly the more data you get?
Yeah, it's a combination of two things. One is the sport, right? So in baseball, our largest predictive is actually Tommy John, UCL injuries. And the big reason why is there's a lot of them, right? And we have 4 years of data now of weekly assessments with MLB teams. So we have a lot of data. Now with football, it's more of a ground-up predictive model. With football in the NFL, our largest prediction is Liz Frank, his foot, which makes sense. It's the first thing in contact with the plate. The next thing is actually ACL. And the theory is they're just, the first part of that chain that interacts with that force production.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for Q&A today. Dr. Wagner, thank you so much. I don't know if you're going to be available outside for more.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.